أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. Hopefully everyone can see me inshallah, can hear me for today's seminar بإذن الله تعالى. All right. So since today's seminar will be our last before we break for Ramadan, I want to keep things a bit light. We don't want to be I don't want to take things um, too uh, you know detailed or too tricky. I just want to keep things simple and light-hearted today, inshallah. However, we will be touching upon the key elements of the first three chapters. We will leave the fourth chapter for after Ramadan because that requires a bit of discussion, and it is very closely tied with the forthcoming chapters in part two. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Right, so inshallah, to begin today's seminar, and since this is our uh, last monthly seminar before we break for Ramadan, the first question I want to begin with is, Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, how has your reading experience been so far? So I want you guys, inshallah, to take a couple minutes and each of you mentions their personal reading experience thus far, especially now that you've had a couple seminars with us, and you've sort of seen how differently reading can be done with a little bit of guidance. And now that you have had an attempt at reading slightly differently to what you were used to as students in your younger years or previous years, inshallah. So I would like you to describe your current reading experience, and I would really appreciate if everyone does that individually, bidni ta'ala. And I would also appreciate if you guys can be a bit quicker so we can move through this seminar with some pace, inshallah. Right. And when I say your reading experience, I mean, um, I want you guys to be explicit, to be open. If it has been very productive or not, and not so much, what your thoughts are about your current reading abilities that you've done that months of, a month of work on it. So things of that nature. I want to know a bit about, a bit of your thoughts on your current reading experience as it stands after a month of reading with Tajdeed Club. You could also mention, have you enjoyed your reading so far, and if it has been interesting and things otherwise. All right, Sister Maria, she says, "Good, Alhamdulillah. I've been using the three stages of reading on chapters 1 and 3, which is very time efficient. I've actually been using this technique for my university readings as well, which has saved me so much time since I used to read every line of the readings, whereas now I just skim read it and then go back to get the main points. Definitely, Alhamdulillah." Sister Hannah mentions it's been a bit tricky. I still haven't really gotten the hang of how we should be tackling the journaling part. I haven't been as consistent as I should have been with it, but I found myself falling back into the habit of highlighting and taking too many notes. I found the summarizing part beneficial though. It's helped me to tie the whole chapter together. Alhamdulillah. طيب. All right, Sister Samir says, I haven't read that much recently, to be honest, but I do appreciate or do approach texts in a different manner than I did before. I try to focus on the structure, etc. طيب, Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Right, so what Sister Maria mashallah has mentioned with regards to the saving of time when it comes to reading literature. right? And not just difficult literature or any particular, especially when it comes to university studies or academic work. This is really the best method that you can adopt for your studies, because when you're going through textbooks, the textbooks are much more well guided, especially modern textbooks. They have clear contents page. They have a very clear guided, headings and subheadings and then summaries and so on and so forth. And even if they're not such nicely laid out, the teachers and the professors, they tell you which pages and which summaries or which chapters to read and which not to read, and so it's quite um, and on top of that, if you do stick to this, the three stages of reading, so the grammar, the logic, and so on and so forth, or at least how we put it, the structural reading and inspectional reading, and then going back and sort of tackling the main points and focusing your energies on the main points of the text, it definitely saves you a lot of time. Um, so that's good, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So it's very refreshing to see that you have been using the strategies in your personal studies at the university as well. Alhamdulillah. Ah, yes. So, Sister Hannah, the issue with journaling, inshallah, we'll talk about this today. I've got some samples for you guys. Inshallah, I'll show you some of my personal journaling before, when I was when I started my studies, like when I was 17 years old, like proper studies. When I started getting serious about reading. Inshallah, so you'll have some samples to sort of draw inspiration from for your personal readings as well. Inshallah, that's not a problem at all. Um, so long you are putting some sort of pen to paper, that's a good start, right? That's a good start. That's way better than someone not doing that at all, or just reading, passively, or half reading and half not paying attention, and so on and so forth. So alhamdulillah, it's very well done, mashallah. Alhamdulillah. Right. So, alhamdulillah, so far, there definitely seems that in just 1 month, you guys seem to have improved your general reading. Would you say that? Would you say that there's that in just 1 month, you've definitely um improved your current reading abilities? There has been a positive change, inshallah. Even if it's a little change, it doesn't have to be a big change. So, so long we are beginning on the, down the right path. Would everyone agree to that, inshallah? Okay, طيب, alhamdulillah. Yes, alhamdulillah. Right. So, inshallah, if you continue, inshallah, down this path of your personal development, you will see much more sort of a compounded benefits to this approach, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And one thing I would like to ask you before we move on to the next question is, since you guys are trying, and doesn't matter if you have succeeded in this or not, but since you guys are trying to read a bit more deeply, and you guys are trying a bit harder to penetrate within the structure of the book and the main arguments, have you realized or have you sort of experienced that you sort of have an enhanced focus when it comes to reading? Has that been the case? Your focus is heightened, your attentiveness, your attention is a lot more peaked when you're reading because you're trying to, read a bit more deeply. Okay, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Very good. You see, when the this is one of the key ways of finding out if you're actually reading well. That is to see how absorbed you are, even if you're not absorbed, how much attention let's put it this way: how much brain power it takes from you. If it's not taking much brain power from you to read, and surely not all readings have to be exhausting. But when you're reading good literature and literature that does demand your focus and it's supposed to enlighten you and develop you as a human being, it does deserve a bit of attention, right? A literature which is worth reading, it is at least worth your focus, right? So when you try and inshallah, do that, um, you try to give its due right to it, and you know that you can only do that by following the strategies of structural readings and then inspectional reading, then going back to it, with a critical reading and analytical reading. You definitely, sort of, so you have to force yourself to focus. And so one of the direct consequences of this type of reading is that it enhances your focus, even if it's in segments, even if it's not sustained. And as we mentioned, hard reading, you can't really sustain it for more than 3 to 4 hours anyway, right? After that, your brain will be fried. You'll be tired, and you'd want to do some other work, some other light reading or something else, right? So it doesn't always have to be this kind of reading for every single book. But inshallah, so that's good to hear, alhamdulillah, that everyone has experienced that positive boost in their focus. And and then on that, have you guys also noticed that to be able to do this kind of reading, you have to be a bit more purposeful and mindful with your time, that that you have to make sure that you actually schedule in time for this kind of reading, as opposed to, oh, I'll just read whenever I have time. Okay, Sister Mari says yes, mashallah. Yes, because it's time consuming, right? It takes more time for you to actually sit down and focus on these types of texts, and of course this type of reading demands your attention. So it definitely means that you are going to be a bit more mindful with your time, right? You're going to be a bit more purposeful with finding time for this kind of reading. Like you can't do this kind of reading on a whim. You can't be like, okay, I'll just read the book when before I go to bed. Like you are going to find some sort of time in the day when you're a bit more attentive, when you're a bit more focused, when you have that kind of energy to drive you through that reading session. Would you agree with that, sisters? Yes. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Right. And of course you have gone through these chapters and you have read her tips on how to do this. And we'll sort of talk about them briefly, inshallah. Right. So now that we've sort of broken the ice and we've started the conversation, the next thing I would really love for you guys to share with me is, are there any personal or best personal takeaways or quotes, statements from her or any author that she's quoted? Um, any best takeaways, right? Any personal takeaways that resonate the most with you and why they resonate with you personally, inshallah. So if you can share some of those quotes with me, it doesn't have to be more than two or three quotes. Even if it's one, doesn't matter. Just share something with me that really resonates with you. Do you try to make it just a bit more quick so we can move on, inshallah, through our seminar? Any particular takeaways that really made you think about your current state of studies or academia, your connection with the ilm, knowledge, studies, um, sort of a drive to study further? Okay, mashallah, well done. Right. Excellent. Well done, mashallah. For Sister Maria, it is the first step towards understanding is to grasp exactly what is being said. And the oldest and most reliable way of grasping information is to put it down into your own words. And for her, it highlighted the importance of summarizing information. Yes, although there is a difference between putting things down into your own words and summarizing them. There's a lot of scientific research into the fact, of summarizing, and how summarizing alone is not a very effective way of studying. However, if you do it in a certain way where you're not exactly copying from the book and you are forcing yourself to sort of recall the best points or the main points, the structure, whatever the case may be through what you've read, and then you try and put it down onto paper, right? That's when inshallah that's what really makes a difference, right? Because you've practiced a few skills at the same time. You've worked up your working memory, and once you recall information like that, it stands a much higher chance of being retained in your long-term memory. Again, and it allows for it to be used later, for whatever reason you may want to use it for, right? So it stays in your mind. So recall, the tool of recalling, and using summarizing in your own words as a way of doing that, that the action of recall is very, very productive. It's very, very efficient, and that is something that what the author is alluding to. Okay, um, not just summarizing for its sake. But well done, mashallah. Excellent quote. Allah barik. Sister Samia, mashallah, excellent quote as well. Don't leap ambitiously into a schedule that has you rising at 5 to spend 2 hours in reading. You're likely to skip it altogether. And she said, I took this as a reminder to myself, as long as I don't overburden myself and try to focus on that which is within my ability, is always better than starting something big and at the end leaving it all together. Yes, excellent, mashallah. This is an excellent reminder, this quote. Um, and this is something that in our mentorship program, inshallah, when we go through the science behind productivity and the art of managing yourself and developing a life of focus, we talk about this principle a lot, especially under the light or of the hadith, which mentions about the greatness and the loftiness of actions which are done consistently, regardless of how small they are. Right? خير الأعمال أدومها وإن قل أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. It's an excellent reminder, mashallah. Even the most trained people, even the most trained ulama, they abide by this principle. They never overburden themselves. Something that connects with this is her statement, where she mentioned how you shouldn't start reading many, many things at the same time, right? Especially things which are disconnected, right? You should start with one reading list at a time, one book at a time, something small, so that it becomes a habit. Forming habits is the most important thing that you can do for your career as a student. If you don't do that, and I keep saying this, and I think I've bored the hell out of my students elsewhere as well, but you'll be wasting 10, 20 years of your life, even if you go to Medina or Al Qura, whatever university, you name it, Oxford or Cambridge, doesn't matter. If you don't work on yourself, build your personal systems, right? And the best way to do that is to start, building these mini keystone habits. And the most important habit is to always start things small and develop them, progress with them over time in a very calculated, slow manner so that it becomes a habit, and it becomes a habit in a very comfortable way so that you don't lose that part of you. It becomes a part of you that over time gives you compounded interest of benefits, right? I use the word interest, but compounded benefits. um inshallah, in the rest, in the other areas of your life. So excellent, mashallah. Well done. All right, Sister Hannah, mashallah, well done. I think for me, it would be how the first step to understanding a book is to just read. No need to understand everything on the first read. Excellent. But just read it and get a brief outline of what the text is about. Usually, we get demotivated when we read something and struggle to understand it first time. So, this gave some reassurance that it's okay. If we don't get it the first time, that's when the logic stage comes in. MashaAllah, well done. And of course, this sort of, sort of hooks into what Sister Sumaya was alluding to, right? You don't need to leap ambitiously into a full-on reading on the first attempt. Only the most skilled readers do that, right? And they hone that ability over years of reading, right? And reading difficult literature and degrees in writing and whatnot. And the more you read, and I'm sure you've read this in the book as well, the more you read and the more you've read in a particular field, any difficult literature, or subsequent difficult literature in that field becomes easier, right? It becomes easier for you to go through, right? So taking one step at a time, you know, breaking down your reading into the stages that we've described, and just dealing with it one piece at a time. The other day we were talking about how crazy it is to drive in Pakistan, and I was telling them how when I first came to Pakistan, after many years, of living in England, um, it was very crazy for me. I was scared of the roads, and I wouldn't drive on the main streets. I was comfortable um, driving in the housing society that we lived in, but generally leaving that would just be very difficult and scary for me initially. But one day I said to myself, I'll just go to the busiest and the most hectic and the most uh you know I don't know, the most the most mad area of Lahore, and I'll just drive through it, and I'll just stop by by a library, which is one of my friend's granddad's famous scholar in Pakistan, passed away, rahimahullah, his library as well, and then there's a book market there nearby. I'll just buy some books over there, and I'll just come back, I'll just do that kind of trip. And the only way I convinced myself that I could do it and sort of tackle that kind of fear was if I just took every 100 meters at a time. I'll just drive 100 meters and see if I've dealt with it. And if at any moment in that journey things go, you know, crazy or out of control, I can just take a U-turn and just come back. I'll just come back home, right? But subhanallah, I just kept going, and every 100 meters I'll just make a decision of continuing the next 100 meters, right? So tackling a milestone at a time, right? And alhamdulillah, like after that day I went through the craziest part of the city. People, they drive as if they want to kill you, but you realize at the end of it, it's just people, right? And they're just going about their daily life, and you learn to cope with that kind of thing, right? So there's madness at every milestone of your reading journey as well, right? And you don't have to worry about the particular madness that's going to show up, three milestones down the line, right? Just yet in the beginning. So that's a very good, mashallah, takeaway. Allah Mubarak. Allah Mubarak. Mubarak. Any other personal takeaways? Any other quotes that really stuck with you and perhaps changed you in a certain way in your mindset about reading and education? Something else you would like to share? All right. Something else that I would like to add to this comment by Sister Hannah. Um, when I was when I was doing my GCSEs, and I was head boy. I was one of the brightest students, alhamdulillah. But even then, I had my struggles with reading. Okay, and so I said to my English teacher once. I said to her, Miss, sometimes I find myself not understanding a passage, and I have to read things a few times. So perhaps 3 4 times um to understand things and make sense of them, and then be able to sort of answer the questions, if there are any questions, or if I'm making sense of any difficult literature that she gives us in the class. So she said to me that you know since you're a bit clever, you get to read, you get the gist of it after 3 4 readings, but I don't expect you to get any gist of it, before 6 to 8 readings, right? So don't worry about it. Like, it's common for students to not understand things on the first reading, especially when the literature is hard, especially when you've not done that kind of reading before, when you're not used to that art, when you don't have the prior experience of reading difficult literature. So I'll I'll just repeat her words to you guys as well. There's no harm in rereading. In fact, rereading is one of the scientifically proven ways of understanding things deeply. And every reader who is a skilled reader, the highly skilled scholars, after some studies were done into how their eyes sort of went back and forth into, while they were reading. They noticed how the most skilled readers, they go back and forth into the same paragraph when they're reading it. So it's proving that they read things again and again just to, understand things deeply, right? They just do that a bit quicker than others. So it doesn't seem as if they read things multiple times, but even the most skilled scholars and seasoned ulama, that is something they do. Okay, so this is something to not be worried about, inshallah. In fact, it's a good thing to not understand things on the first time, or at least not to understand everything on the first time, right, on your first read. Save things, especially as the metaphor goes. Some books are to be tasted, some to be swallowed, and others to be digested, right? So you don't have to digest the book on the first bite. You just have to taste it and then enjoy the taste of it. And then you go back and you try and swallow it. And then you go back and you sort of try and digest it, properly. Okay? Some books are like water. You don't have to do any, biting, or they don't have any taste, or they have little taste, and they don't require any effort in swallowing or digesting. It just goes through the system, like fiction, right? But when we are talking about classical books, the great books, books that have changed the course of human history, we have to, of course, expect this kind of hardship. Okay, inshallah, alhamdulillah. So we are good so far. Now, let us now progress on with our seminar with questions that I planned for these actual chapters that you've read. Now, alhamdulillah, we have had a detailed seminar on the structural reading, alhamdulillah, and so you've seen how deeply you can read by just breaking down the main points of a book, just breaking down the structure, not even starting to read into the content of the main arguments or anything of that nature. Just by breaking down the book into its structure, right? How much you can achieve, right? So we've seen that, alhamdulillah. We've gone through that phase. If anyone wants a bit more sort of revision of that, you can always go back and inshallah check that seminar. It's recorded, right? But today I want to, inshallah, of course, these ideas that we're going to discuss today, the seminars are not meant to answer things for you, right? They're supposed to be a discussion on how the reading has progressed so far. Inshallah, towards the end of your reading of this book, inshallah, you'll be handed a reading guide. And in that, inshallah, the concepts that have been talked about in this chapter will be addressed by myself, inshallah. And they'll show you the kind of objective lens with which a Muslim should be reading these books. Okay. So inshallah, that is going to happen, but we don't want to do it just yet because we don't want to give you any partiality or biasness when it comes to reading these books. Read them with an open mind, with your own lens. Make sense of whatever makes sense to you, and put question marks. Ask questions. Be critical about things that don't make sense to you and you think that probably go against your own beliefs or Islam, whatever the case may be, right? So inshallah, so you can sort of just do that. This phase is just for you to tackle with the book, with yourself, inshallah, and for me to just ask you guys questions and how you've progressed, right? The reading guides, inshallah, will give you that kind of check towards the end, inshallah. Okay, so that just so that we don't cause any partiality or biasness while you're reading these texts just yet, inshallah. Right. So on chapter one, we said last time the whole chapter was answering one question, right? Can you remind me what that question was? She was trying to sell you something, right? An idea, something. And what we talked about that at length. What was it? Yes, yes, well done, mashallah. Yes. So briefly put, what is classical education? And of course, she was trying to sell you something, right? So she was trying to prove to you why you need that classical education, why it's good for you, right? So when she talked about the classical education and she described it for you, um, I would like each of you to sort of, in your own words, in just one paragraph, explain to me what you guys understand classical education to mean. What do you understand when the word classical education is used? What have you understood it from the author's statements about classical education? Do the best job you can, inshallah, to describe what she means by classical education. Hmm. I'm just waiting for your answers now, inshallah. Right. Sister Maria has shared her input. She says classical education is about education through a set of literature rather than in formal institutions. We will allow the other sisters to comment on that reply as well, inshallah, if they agree with Sister Maria about what she understands classical education to be. Because the author, I believe, has been a bit more specific with her definition and what she describes as classical education. Sister Rabia mentions classical education is of child to think and live in this world. Um, I would love for you guys to share as your understanding of the author, inshallah, to the best of your ability, right? So I can sort of gauge how well you've understood the main crux of this chapter, inshallah. Right. Sister Hannah says it's enjoying the journey of reading and finding it a delight rather than a frustration. Yes, all of that would be a fruit of classical education. Yes. And what Sister Maria has mentioned, classical education is about education through a set of literature rather than in formal institutions. You see, a set of literature can be read in a formal institution, and that is exactly what Thomas Jefferson and others were doing in their day and age. So this set of literature was actually taught in formal institutions. It was read in formal institutions. So that wouldn't describe classical education, right? So think again, inshallah. So I would say that this, what you have described, this is education through a set of literature, right? Rather than observation, which is scientific education, such as through the STEM subjects, for example, right? And other forms of education which require more of a physical input, such as military education, you know, cadet education, so on and so forth. These are different forms of education, and there's more types. But I'm not sure if you guys had the opportunity to actually delve into different forms of education that have existed in the past. But uh, this idea of education through a set literature, particularly uh, of a nature which has changed the course of history, books that have changed the world, right? So this set of literature is the operation through which classical education is done. But what is classical education? What does she mean by that? Sister Rabbi mentioned education to live. Yes, so that will be a fruit of it. Yes, that'll be a fruit of it according to the author. Right. It's an education that frees your mind. It's an education that you find delight in, rather than frustration, and so on and so forth. I mean, some people might still find frustrating to read Aristotle or Plato or others, because they're not quite easy to read. But at the end of the day, yes, the fruit of classical education would be that it makes you, uh, you know, alive and live, as in be enlightened, right? Self-education through literature. So classical education can be done if you read um, in the book. It mentions how the classical schoolmaster, it divides education into a few stages, right? And you've read about the grammar stage, the logic stage, and the rhetoric stage. This, in summary, is what classical education is. The trivium. Do you guys remember the word trivium from the book? Right. So classical education essentially is an education that, if you go back, inshallah, I'm not sure exactly which page it is, but I believe it's somewhere around 10, I think about yes, so it's on page number 18 in the book, where it says the world is full of self-improvement methods. What's distinctive about classical education? Right? And then she mentions Francis Bacon, some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and others, etc., etc., etc. Right? Um, but she says if you like Bacon, the classical schoolmaster, so schoolmaster, i.e., a formal education setting, divides learning into three stages, generally known as the trivium. Okay, so this description of trivium is her answer to what is classical education. Okay, classical education is essentially education through the trivium. You guys with me, inshallah? Classical, if for you to answer that question in one line, would be classical education is the education of a young mind through the trivium. Okay, through the trivium. And by the trivium, she mentions trivium, i.e., from tri, i.e., three, and vium, i.e., by media, to three media or three stages, and that would be, or three components, and that would be grammar, then logic, and then rhetoric. Of course, as Muslims, we can, we can sort of critique that construct. We can critique that sort of understanding, and inshallah we will do that towards the end of it. But it's not the time to do it just yet. First is how well have you understood the author? That is my main concern so far in this, inshallah. Okay. Arts work is also considered in classical education. That is very, very correct. Okay. Trivium is the first stage in classical education, and if you, inshallah, developed a bit more understanding of what classical education was back in the day, there is a subsequent level which is quadrivium. Okay, quadrivium. Um, and normally that would include four uh, subsequent development spheres, and one of them would be arts, for example, right? Some of them also included music within arts. Some of them included calligraphy within arts. Okay, some of them had literature. There was astronomy, for example, in it. But this quadrivium has changed over the history of the course of history and has included many, many chapters, sciences, subjects, and so on and so forth. But what is important is the trivium, right? At the heart of all classical education, and classical education, as we mentioned, is done through the written word. It's done through the medium of it. The operation of it is set literature, the great books, so to speak. And the way it's done is through the trivium, i.e., the student goes through a good grasp of what the author says, so the grammar stage, his words or her words, and a very, very good structural, inspectional, and analytical understanding of the author's work, right? Or sorry, before analytical, just a very good structural understanding of the main points and the main structure of the author's claim and arguments and so on and so forth. And then that is when they're young, when they're kids. As they grow up a bit, they develop the logical capabilities. Okay, so when they go through those logical application of their minds upon the same set of facts or um, uh, texts, whatever they've come across before. But now, when they come back at it, they're not just looking at the structure of it or just seeing or trying to gauge the main points. Now, they're going at the main points with the critical mind. Now they are analyzing things. So they're thinking about it logically. We call this evaluation. Okay, they evaluate the texts. There's trying to swallow things. Okay, they're trying to swallow things. They've tasted it already in the grammar stage. Now they want to swallow it, right? And they swallow it by analyzing things, being critical about it, asking lots of questions, just so that they can understand the author as deeply as possible, as truly as possible, right? And then try and form their own opinions later in the third stage, which is the rhetoric stage, where they try and digest the book, right? And that is when they truly form their own unique opinions. Okay, that's this process, this three-stage process, is normally what is referred to as the classical education. Okay, the classical education, and this is what the author has sort of answered, right, on page number 18, right? So she goes into this, and she explains this. The first stage of education is called the grammar stage, and da da da. Right, and so critical thinking comes into play during the second stage of education, the logic stage, and she goes on to say towards the end. So the final years of education focus on elegant, articulate expression of opinion in speech and writing, the study of rhetoric. So this is essentially the whole of classical education in a nutshell. Then she says, classically educated students know that this pattern applies to all later learning. Okay. And then she says, if you haven't been classically educated, so essentially she's saying that if you haven't been classically educated, i.e., all of what I've described above is what classical education is through the grammar stage, then the logic, then the rhetoric stage, you can still do so. And this is what this book is going to teach you. Okay, this is what the book is going to teach you. Okay, inshallah. So this is a description. This is the kind of basic understanding that I want you guys to be able to, or to have developed so far or thus far in today's or up to today's seminar, inshallah. Right. So what is classical education? Classical education essentially is an education done via the trivium. Okay. Which book is this? Sister Rabia, if you I'm not sure if you've joined the main channel, the main Tajdeed Seminary channel. If you have, there is a link to the PDF. Okay. There's a PDF. of the main text that we're reading at the moment, and the targets for each week, inshallah. So if you can, if someone, in fact, I don't think students will be able to share it. Let me just share the link with you for the Tajdeed club, inshallah, just so that you have access to it. So this is the Telegram link, okay, inshallah. This is the Telegram link, okay. If you join this Telegram group, all the resources are shared over there, okay. So how did you join this meeting, Sister Rabia? Are you a part of the sisters group? Right, were you invited by someone else for today's lecture? Ah, okay. طيب, inshallah. No worries. طيب, okay. Right, so everyone, alhamdulillah, we will just progress with this. So classical education, is everyone clear on this idea? Right, since this is not a class, I'm not supposed to be teaching, all right? I'm not so you guys are supposed to be doing the work. Um, so what is so when we say so when I asked you guys what is classical education, did any of you think about the trivium? Did anyone think of this answer that we just mentioned? This is Maria, Sumaya, and Hannah. Sisters, you've been reading this. Aha. So Sister Hannah would have won this round, but she second guessed herself, subhanAllah. So well done on that. At least that you've written down that that down as a summary, alhamdulillah. But as I said, your answers are correct, generally speaking. Classical education does rely on a set literature. It is an education through the world classics, right? It primarily presumes, inshallah, you read about this in the guide, basically. But just to mention it briefly, classical education, as per the Western liberal mindset, classical education essentially is an education which assumes that not a lot more textbooks need to be written, not a lot of secondary literature needs to be produced, right? The great books are there. A human being only has a limited amount of time in their life to read, and they should only focus on literature that is worth their time, right? And so therefore it highly specializes in focusing on only the great books. Okay. Now, of course, we've said that that is only one type of education, and primarily speaking, that is as students of knowledge, that is that is the primary form of education for ourselves as well. So that is useful for us to know. But what is more important, the reason why we're reading this book is so that we can actually become better readers, inshallah, just as it is a form of training before we get into the reading of difficult literature itself. Okay. So, alhamdulillah, in a nutshell, all of your answers are correct. Some of you mentioned the fruits of it. Some of you mentioned the operations of classical education. And and um and even if you second guessed yourself, inshallah, doesn't matter. What you have understood is good. Is that is exactly what I was hoping for from your studies, inshallah. Right. So the overarching concept is correct. Alhamdulillah. It is an education that is done through the world classics. Alhamdulillah. And the rest of the chapter really it's just about how to actually go about it. So, structuring yourself and, sticking to something, one thing at a time, something small, and read in a chronological pattern, not read in a haphazard manner like this German theologian. I'm not sure how you read his name in German, but Friedrich or Schleiermacher. I'm not sure how to say this. I wouldn't even bother. But this German theologian, you don't want to end up like him. And in fact, subhanallah, we have had cases in our history, and I've seen this in some Pakistani ulama. May Allah forgive their shortcomings. But one of the reasons, and they came from the Salafi background, they came from an Ahlul Hadith background, but because of this haphazard reading, this unstructured reading of just reading just everything, or starting from the wrong books, right? And sort of just reading this haphazard way of going about literature, they ended up developing Shi'i views, started favoring some positions of the Shias. And subhanAllah, they repented towards the end of their life. May Allah forgive them for the shortcomings. But this is a problem. Okay. So unstructured reading, just reading of everything. It's not a good advice. Unless it's just fiction towards the beginning years of a child, a very young child. You're trying to give them love of reading, so you give them as many books to read, and that's good initially for a very young child, because you want to give them that love for books, right? But just as they've developed enough competence with reading, you move them away from fiction and you give them books which are important, books which are worth their time. So they develop through those years very quickly. You don't have to keep a child for 18 years, right? A child can learn, they can start to grapple with difficult books very early on. You don't have to keep a child. This is a mistake we make in parenting. We keep children for a very long time, you know. The children don't have to stay like that. They can develop very early on and start tackling difficult literature, and they can start tackling the problems of life for a lot younger, and achieve a lot more maturity and be able to be conducive for their societies that they live in. Okay. Right. So the next chapter, inshallah, let me just quickly see if there's anything yeah, so yes, basically that. Sticking to one thing, one list at a time, right? And studying the whole thing in its chronological pattern, so how the books were written, as opposed to modern books first and then going backwards. Okay. Um, so this actually a pedagogical uh principle that she's alluding towards. She's saying that read the books as they were written. So, how we normally assume that instead of reading Shakespeare, we should read some of its summaries or some of the modern explanations of Shakespeare before we actually read Shakespeare, because that will just prime our minds for Shakespeare. More often than not, what actually happens, right? What ends up happening is that a student makes a mind, or makes up a mind about Shakespeare, right? Which probably wouldn't have been the case if he had or she had read Shakespeare on the first instance. They would have read Shakespeare in a different light, perhaps. Okay, and I can share my personal experience with it. For example, in school, we were meant to, we were made to memorize, the biography of Shakespeare, brief biography, and in that we were made to, believe about him certain things, which but I later discovered in my first hand reading of Shakespeare, that were not quite exactly correct or representative of his true personality. For example, when I read his sonnets, he was highly so in today's terms you would call that man conservative, although in the words of his contemporaries you would call him a very modern and very free individual, especially working in that kind of drama industry and so on and so forth. But he's the kind of person who is encouraging women to get married at a young age and have children, and so on and so forth. Very much, different from what you would consider a man who is labeled as a womanizer or whatever the case may be, right? But anyway, it goes to show that her pedagogical principle that she's saying, start reading, chronologically. As, for example, instead of reading political science textbook today, go back and read the first book on political philosophy, perhaps, right? And then sort of come down, right? Sort of come down. And then you will sort of have a much better sense of how things developed, right? Um, Although inshallah you learn later that when you read those first level books, the first text that have ever been written on that sign on that field, on that subject, right? You would be using some of these tertiary sources, the secondary sources, just to understand the main text sometimes because you don't understand it completely. Inshallah, but more of that development will come later, right? But in this first chapter, when she's describing a classical education, she does assume this to be the best form of education, right? Instead of going bottom up, she says, come, down in your reading, right? So read literature as it was written and then come towards the modern times. Now, as a question, how much do you agree with that? As individuals, with your own unique experiences with education, how would you agree or disagree with that principle? Perhaps you can think of it in some Islamic terms. How does Islam see that as a principle? Yes, so the author on page 21, she says that she quotes Jefferson, she says, to organize this systematic reading around chronology. And she says the book lists I include are arranged in chronological order for this very reason. It is easier to understand a subject if you begin with its foundational works and then read systematically through those books that build one layer at a time on this foundation. So this is the principle that she sort of gives you on page number 21. Do you agree with this principle that you should start with the first book in the subject and then you come down? Or should you start with something of a modern textbook that sort of summarizes everything to do with that field, and then slowly but surely you move up the ladder. You go upwards, back into time, and you read literature as it was written back in time, sort of in that order, so bottom up as opposed to coming down, with the first book written on that subject. Yes, since it's important to build knowledge upon a foundation in order to build upon that. Right, but do you agree with her principle that you should have this top-down approach with knowledge as opposed to bottom-up? Because you can very, very clearly apply this to the study of Islam as well. And this is a very, very um, you know, heated debate amongst amongst the students of knowledge and scholars. Yeah, Sister Hannah says it depends on your capabilities. It does have its benefits, right? Sister Samaya says, yeah, I would agree with the bottom up method, right? So if you agree, or if any of you does agree with the bottom up method, would you also agree that when you go from bottom up, you are more prone to carry presumptions and suppositions of the modern authors, and those suppositions and presumptions might be biased, that may affect your further or future understanding of the subject when you read higher literature. Or perhaps when you read higher literature, your understanding of that literature is sort of detrimented by your initial readings by the modern authors. Could that be a flaw, a drawback of this um, bottom-up method? It is definitely a flaw in the Islamic circles, because there's two things at war. There's two things that are confronting each other. There is ease of study, right? And there is authenticity in your understanding of the material. Which would you rather pick? Unless someone can point another dichotomy to me, or perhaps another dimension to this problem. Hmm. So Sister Connie says, okay, wa alaikum salam wa barakatuh. She says, as top down may make you become more rigid. Why would you assume that coming top down make someone more rigid in their views? Why would that be the case? Why would we assume that to be the case? Surely they would be more open because they understand how things have developed, or at least they would see how people in its initial stages were thinking, and they'll be more open to future interpretations, and perhaps they'll be able to see where the future authors were dishonest, perhaps, or they were misunderstood, or they misinterpreted the first authors. Since you're reading with a fresh lens, you're not reading with a lens that was put on you, right? So authenticity again. It's definitely true. I'm with you guys on the fact that it's definitely true that if you stick to a bottom up approach, things will be a lot more easier. Uh, a lot more easier because modern authors, they will have summarized every single thing that has happened in a science, right? For you, and then when you go back in the timeline, you're able to make sense of things a lot more, right? A lot more. So it's easier. That the approach is easier. But as I said, authenticity is at is compromised more often than not, not always. Right. I'll give you an example, right, just to make things a bit more contextualized. You see, in the context of usul al-fiqh, right? We know the science usul al-fiqh. Everyone is familiar with the term usul al-fiqh, right? The study of legal hermeneutics in Islam, right? Usul al-fiqh, the principles that you use, that you apply to gain an understanding of the nusus, right? All the principles that are used, right? The usul, basically, the principles of legal interpretation, right? So a common debate that you'd find amongst the modern ulama is that the madhabists, those ulama which cling to a particular madhab, right? They define things in a certain way, right? They have definitions. They've made certain definitions, such as the word taqleed, right? Now, taqleed is defined in many, many different ways. Some of it would be abhorrent to all groups, but the majority of them. Um, some understanding of it would be unacceptable to some, but acceptable to others. And understanding of it, uh, might be acceptable to all of the groups, right? For example, the word taqleed, which one of the meanings of the word taqleed, is, and I'm not giving you the linguistic meaning. I'm giving you the technical meaning. The word taqleed is that someone who does not have the legal ability to ask a scholar and follow his opinion, right? Because he doesn't have the legal ability to go and interpret the nusus himself or herself. Therefore, they ask a question to the sheikh and they rely on their opinion because they trust them to follow the Quran and the Sunnah. And they call this taqleed. Okay. And then, of course, there's taqleed in its actual meaning, which is blind following, like a monkey follows a man, as the linguistic dictionaries talk about the word taqleed, to actually blind follow without any dalil, any evidence whatsoever. And that is unfortunately the case with most, groups when it comes to the study of al-fiqh, right? Just to memorize things and just to understand the positions of the madhab without actually knowing the dalil. Or even when you know the dalil, you don't have the ability to actually infer the meaning, the ruling from that dalil. So therefore, you remain a muqallid even if you've done a mufti course, even if you study for 20 years, right? 20 years, you're not able to infer things on your own. So you're not a independent thinker or jurist in that nature, right? So you're not a mujtahid essentially. So you remain a muqallid even after studying for 10, 20 years because you studied in that, framework. Okay. So that of course would be, not acceptable as per the understanding of the Salaf Salihin, right? And then there's, taqleed, which is unacceptable to all major schools of thought, which is to blind follow an imam or a scholar, completely, or at least just one of them completely, or all of them, or at least one of the four, or one of the six, whatever the case may be, blindly, without questioning, without understanding, and or just any scholar, right? There's, peers, trusting your peer sab, right? Or Sufi sheikh, saint, right? And not questioning, some of the bid'at, for example, that they do, or so not the Aima, astaghfirullah, not Imam Abu Hanifa or Malik or Shafi'i or Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahumullah. I'm referring to the modern day, fake saints that people normally in our culture, especially in subcontinent culture, they go to, and I think it's quite common in African cultures as well, and of course some of the Arab cultures also have it, right? But the point being that the word taqlid, you can see how many different ways people understand the word, right? Now, the first meaning of it that I explained, right? We have the Sharia and the ulama of the Salaf Salihin, the initial mutaqaddimun, right? The initial ulama, they didn't define this kind of asking question taqlid. You see, Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, and funny, I was, I read a risala of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, um, in the hospital when, subhanallah, my wife was in labor, and as I was making dua, I was reading risala, and as I was reading the book Ar-Risala of Imam Shafi'i, the first book that was written on usul al-fiqh, basically, or usul al-Islam essentially. And although it's not structured as we now understand usul fiqh to be, or at least how we want it to be, right, for us, for the sake of our ease, right? The principles that Imam Shafi'i gives you and the language he uses, it shows you the understanding of the Salaf Salihin when it comes to understanding the usul of the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, right? And in many ways it differs. Imam Shafi rahimahullah, in one of his initial pages, very at the beginning of his risala, his book, he differentiates between taqleed and as-su'al, right? Because Allah Azza wa Jal calls the asking of a layman, a scholar, a question, and then relying on his opinion, as-su'al, right? Not taqleed, right? So these kinds of, right? So you may study with a modern scholar, perhaps, right? And I'm not saying that this is categorically haram or wrong, but I'm saying how going bottom up affects your definitions and gives you a bias to certain things, certain outlooks, right? You start seeing things from a lens, okay? For example, if you ever happen to debate a madhabist, someone who clings to a madhab, or at least a madhabist approach, that you must follow a madhab, you must, belong to a madhab, in order for you to be talib al-ilm and become a mufti and faqih and so on and so forth, right? For them to, to claim on, cling onto this claim, they have to justify that the Sahaba or the ulama that came after them, Tabi'een and Atba'u Tabi'een, they were they were also madhabists, right? And they will say, look, there was a madhab of Ibn Abbas, and there was a madhab of Mas'ud, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, and this is the madhab of Umar, and this is the madhab of, Abdullah bin Jabir, and so on and so forth, right? So they conflate the terms, right? It's a fallacy of, equivocation, where the term madhab is used as, both ways, but the word madhab was not used in the same sense back in the day. Madhab is ma dhahaba ilayhi Ibn Abbas, his opinions essentially. Madhab refers to the opinions of the Sahaba and their understanding, right? But it's not how, it is understood by these, the blind followers of the different madhab. Okay. So this is just an example that I've given you from the Islamic studies point of view. Okay. So I'm just giving you both perspectives, and I'm saying the second option, bottom up option, can be. It is definitely easier. It is definitely easier for a layman and for a newcomer, for a student of knowledge. It is the job of a teacher to correct his understanding from, from day one. So when it comes to that, if you can find a good teacher when it comes to Islamic studies, someone who's mutqin, someone who's been trained by the right ulama, the right people, and the right manhaj, then that sheikh, that ustad, will definitely do his best to give you the right definitions and the right usul from day one. So when you study the word taqleed in a book of usul, or you study a particular terminology in a beginner book of usul, you will correct your understanding according to the manhaj of the salaf from day one, right? So it really comes down to the job of a teacher as well. But if you were tackling a subject, unaided, didn't have a teacher, what would you choose? So Sister Hannah says, I think top down requires more effort since you're tackling the original works, and they would be harder to understand and require further explanation from individuals who are more well versed on these works. So for laymen, it would be better to go for the more recent works since they'll help us to have an idea of where our thoughts should be going. Right. And then Sister Mary says, but if one, for example, starts completely new, do you think they should go directly to the works of the Imam without reading an explanation on it? Right. Very, very, very good comments. And of course, I'm not going to answer things for you, but I'm going to make you think on this. Right. Let's just go through Sister Hannah's comment first. Right. Um, top down requires more effort since you're tackling the original works. Why does tackling the original or automatically imply that you are going to need more effort? Why is that the case? Surely the original, if you think about, now I'm just playing, you know, for a lack of a better term, the devil's advocate. I'm just trying to counter your understanding. When thoughts develop, ideas develop, they become more complex. So surely in the beginning, right, um, when the ideas are not as developed, they're quite at the beginning of its development. Surely they should be much more simpler than what they are now, having, uh, haven't developed over thousands of years. So surely studying the original idea and then studying its progression and its development over time as it developed would make more sense, right? Like we do in mathematics, it's much more easier. Studying the initial works of the Greek authors and then coming down. And in fact, we've practically seen this with students. The students, they find it a lot more interesting to start with the works of the Greeks or the very, very initial works in mathematics, and then coming down to modern. So they're sort of understanding how the X, Y, and Z come into being. Like, why do we even use X, Y, and Z, these notations and whatnot? So how would you tackle that? That's just the first part of your um. So why would you assume that starting with the original it takes more effort? And it would be harder to understand. And okay, so you do have a valid point. It would require further explanation from individuals who are more well versed on these works. Don't you think that also stands true for modern works, for a layman anyway, right? If you're a layman and you've never studied something on political science, perhaps studying Plato and studying, I don't know, John Locke, right? It's equally hard. And in either case, you are going to need explanations, commentaries, right? And no one denies the use of commentaries for you, so long you're reading the actual work. Right? These are questions, food for thought for you to answer, and I'm waiting for your answers, inshallah. So I'm just going to throw these questions at you, let you answer them, and then I want to turn to Sister Samia's question as well, inshallah. One last thing about Sister Hannah's comment. They'll help us to have an idea of where our thoughts should be going. Um, would they actually help you to have an idea of where your thoughts should be going? Because now you have a bias to where your thoughts should be going, as opposed to let your thoughts go where they may on a first reading. So these questions are only for Sister Hannah, Sister Samir. Let her, I want her to answer these questions. The first question was, why does she assume that tackling the original would definitely be harder to understand and it will take more effort? Why must that necessarily be the case? Right? And secondly, you need explanation from individuals who are more well versed. But that's the case with any modern literature. Even when you study a small modern book on usul fiqh, you are going to need a teacher anyway. There's always going to be a teacher or a commentary, something that you are going to need in order to understand any text. And thirdly, to help us understand, to help us to have an idea of where our thoughts should be going, surely that help is not much of a help if it makes you develop a bias and sort of narrows your mind on a given subject. Right. Sister Hannah says, I don't have any counter arguments. Very valid questions. I know. And both sides have pros and cons. I think I was answering from the perspective of what I would have done. Yes. So, alhamdulillah, it's a very natural discussion to have, and a lot of people face these issues. And mostly beginners, they start off with modern textbooks because they're just easier, just saves you that mental effort. Um, however, starting, in, let me just not answer that just yet. Just one second. Let me just go back to system question. If one starts completely new, do you think they should go directly to the works of the Aimma without reading an explanation on it? Okay. Now this is interesting. Reading something from the Aimma, right? Um, does not necessarily mean that you are going to find it hard, or you are going to definitely need an explanation for it. Of course, more often than not, you would, right? You would. um, but it doesn't necessarily mean it. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is it comes down to your training in Arabic language. Okay, the more comfortable you are with reading classical texts, the more easier uh, it will be for you to tackle classical texts. Okay, for example, and you can try and answer this question for me. Which modern textbook was um Imam al-Muzani using, one of the students of Imam Shafi'i, on Usul Fiqh? The only textbooks they had at that time on Usul Fiqh was Ar-Risala by Imam Shafi'i. Okay. Okay. Another example. Muqaddimah ibn Salah is the primers. It's the leading textbook on Ulum al-Hadith. And all the modern textbooks that have ever been written on the topic of Ulum al-Hadith as a general subject, they sort of depend on Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah. Okay? Muqaddimah ibn Salah. Now, Muqaddimah ibn Salah was actually written as a textbook for the students. So, if you came a generation after Ibn Salah, the only textbook you would have had at your disposal would have been Muqaddimah ibn Salah, right? But Ibn Hajar came, years down the line and wrote his Nukhba and Nuzha and so on and so forth, and others came later and wrote Bayquniya, and others came later and wrote other textbooks, you know. Um, if you just assume yourself to be a bit further back in the timeline and ask yourself, which textbooks do I have available, right? Students have existed, right? Laymen, beginner students have always existed, right? Who start their studies completely new, right? And if the only textbooks they have at their disposal are the texts that you classify as difficult and you know archaic, surely should have been just as difficult for them. The thing that differs between you and them is two things, right? One is the training in the Arabic language. If you were just as confident in the Arabic language, right, you would have easily gone to the bigger books and tackled them easier. Just like, for example, when you study medicine and you're comfortable in English, right, you can tackle big books in medicine from day one. Right? Gray's Anatomy, even in its abridged version that the medicine students do study, it's a huge book, right? But it doesn't deter the students from reading medicine or studying medicine, right? And using Gray's Anatomy as one of the primer textbooks. And although Gray's Anatomy is one of the classical textbooks on anatomy, okay, but no one says we can't read it, right? So training in a language definitely helps you get to that break that initial barrier. Secondly, access to someone, a scholar who is mutqin, expert, and they can guide you through it. So the first thing is comfort with the language, and the second is having access to a good teacher or good commentary for that matter, right? Commentaries of authors who are reliable. They also serve the job of a teacher. Okay, so I hope that's understood. Now, would you agree that if you, Sumaya, were born 600, 700, or say 900 years before, and the only textbook you had available was the textbook of Muqaddimah ibn Salah, right? And your Arabic was just as proficient as any other Arab around you, do you think you would still feel the need of finding a modern textbook when there was no other textbook? You would only have one textbook, right? So only what would you do in that situation? Exactly. You would read just that one textbook, right? And then you would do anything that would make you understand that one textbook. So it saves you time. The modern curriculums, a huge problem with them is this idea of too many textbooks, too many textbooks, too many books to cover before you get to a certain stage with your ilm, right? And I had a gathering with some of my students. They came to my house and we were talking, and I was telling them there's only 6 subjects. If you master them, you've essentially acquired the gist of your education, right? 3 in Lugha and 3 in Usul. The rest is Quran and Sunnah, right? And the Fahm of the Salaf Salihin. If you can just do two books, one beginner or slash intermediate, depending on your Arabic level. These students have good Arabic reading skills. They're not as advanced in the sciences, but they're good with the Arabic reading. Um, just one intermediate level book, or like a small 100-page book or 90-page book, a text, small text, and then one comprehensive text. And study that with, a proper sheikh, proper, mutqin, sheikh, who can sort of give you all the tools, all the important bits of that knowledge in that one comprehensive text, and then that becomes your reference, right? You finished your education, right? The rest is reading for the rest of your life. Right? You're going to develop. You're going to continue reading for the rest of your life and developing for the yourself for the rest of your life. But the initial education shouldn't be as complicated, right? And likewise, reading the great books, the whole point behind that is this approach of coming top down. In fact, Imam At-Tarifi, rahimahullah, astaghfirullah, hafidhahullah, may Allah protect him and preserve him. Um, he and there he's one of the fuqaha of modern times. Some ulama have compared him to Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, because of his memory and whatnot, and he's memorized the books of hadith, and so he's in prison. May Allah, ease his release. But he was asked this question, and he basically says that, on the contrary to the current approach, which is to study the modern textbooks and going back, in the timeline, you start with the Quran, the Hadith, the aqwal of the Salaf Salihin, and then you sort of come down and you see the madhahib develop in front of your own eyes. Once you've tasted the Quran and the Sunnah in its pure form, and of course, he assumes that he already had the sciences of the Arabic language mastered and so on and so forth. And he was reading, books of comparative fiqh even before that. But if we just keep those advantages to aside for a moment, he's giving us the same approach. Okay, same approach of top down as opposed to bottom up. But as you guys pointed out earlier, it's definitely harder for you to go top down. Much easier to go bottom up. But I also highlighted the reasons for that. One are the teachers who have made things dumb, and they like to dumb things down for the students even more, and they continue doing that every day. As we go, there's more textbooks published every year, on the same subject that doesn't really need more textbooks. Okay. And then, as I said, it also there's a problem with the biases that people develop, and they give passed down to the students, and the students sort of develop those biases. They don't even understand or realize that when they are going through texts and when they're reading through books, they have those biases subconsciously, filtering information in their minds. Okay, and that sort of detriments their further education. Okay. Just give me 1 second. I'll have to put my laptop on charge so before it dies. Right, I just to change places just so that we can finish the seminar today, inshallah. Right, so I was saying that so for a modern student, studying through modern textbooks has its advantages because they're easier, but they're easier for the reasons I've mentioned. The modern scholars, they have or the pedagogues, they have dumbed down the curriculums, simplified the language to the modern standards, so much so that the modern student, he or she would struggle to open a classical textbook. But the problem does not lie in the difficulty of the concepts that they're studying. The difficulty lies in the training that these students have had in, one, the Arabic language, and second, the critical thinking or development of the mind. Okay, so these are the two primary reasons why modern students would definitely struggle going top down. So bottom up is a good way to go because of a lack of good Arabic training and perhaps a lack of good teachers. But secondly, you do need to find a good teacher who is on the manhaj of the Salaf al-Salihin, and he's trained, and he's not just a Salafi. You need someone who is a mutqin, usuli, and he guides you to the manhaj of the Salaf in everything, down to the very definitions of things, down to the very definitions of the things that you study in these books. Is the definition proven from the Quran and the Sunnah or not? Don't just assume things for the sake of being beginner, or for the sake of being a beginner. Okay. Anyway, so she gave us this concept of a top-down approach with education, and that is what classical education normally sort of goes through. Because classical education, it assumes a good training in the languages, right? It assumes that, of course. So it assumes for you to tackle a classical textbook or classical book, a great book like Plato or Aristotle, even if it's difficult. And it wants you to figure things out as you go along. It doesn't stop you from accessing modern textbooks. It doesn't stop you from accessing commentaries. It doesn't stop you from asking questions to modern scholars of that field. What it does require of you, simply put, is to take a classical textbook, assuming that you have had a good foundation in the languages, right? Especially what she does in chapter 2, to sort of see how well you are ready to tackle this reading. If you're not, then she gives you some books to sort of study and prepare yourself for this kind of work. But assuming that you have a good linguistic foundation, you tackle the great books themselves directly, and all the pieces of information that you do need are acquired as you go along. Scientifically speaking, this can be seen as a project-based learning. Is everyone familiar with different modes of learning, such as project-based learning and learning first and then application and so on and so forth? It's application-based learning, project-based learning, goal-oriented learning, right? So project-based learning, as has been shown by science, is the most effective form of learning. Okay? Why? Because you're learning for the sake of building a project. Okay, so you're creating something. According to Bloom's taxonomy, which is a framework for understanding how effective different learning styles are, and we talk more about this in our mentorship, inshallah. But the greatest and the most efficient form of learning is to create, and to at least, or to, in other words, is to build a project. And one of the ways of building a project is to, have a project, right? So, and one of the projects that we can sort of think of in terms of education is to tackle a great book. And it's a project. You just have to tackle this book. And if you can finish this one textbook, right, one great book in one science, right, you've essentially, by way of tackling that one book, right, even though it's difficult, even though it's way harder, of course, because you're not just reading one book, you're reading like 5, 6, 7 books at the same time and asking questions and this and that, right? You would have, by way of it, by building this project kind of, right, analogy, you would have acquired a much more efficient and deeper understanding of the concept that you're dealing with. I'll give you an example. For example, I didn't really, I hadn't studied political economy as such as a student when I was studying things, politics and philosophy and whatnot. But there's a book called Why Nations Fail, right? And the book is essentially about political economy. So when I was reading this book, and I would consider this book to be a modern classic, Why Nations Fail. The book basically refers to political economy concepts, right? And so to be able to deeply understand this book, I had to look at what political economy was, although I knew what the term meant, but I didn't really understand it properly. So I had to go and look up the word and sort of understand it deeply, its application, some of its, some of its textbooks, just so I could make sure that whatever the authors were saying, I understood it properly. And then I would come back to the text and I would continue with my journey, doing the same steps, breaking the book down into its main arguments, its structures, and then sort of analyzing its main arguments and understanding the author truly and honestly, and then making up my own mind about certain things. Okay, is that clear, inshallah? Is that clear for everyone? Bidinillah ta'ala? Right, so that is one concept she gives us, and we've sort of spent the past hour just challenging that one pedagogical principle, and we've seen a lot of fruit of that. Okay, so essentially, this is a real-time example of reading a textbook, which you're not ready for perhaps, but then by way of sort of argument and discussion and going, out of the book and exploring other resources, and then coming back to the book, right? You've understood what she means, and then you can sort of take it or leave it, as far as the arguments are concerned. Okay. In any case, that is still the first chapter, and we're just dealing with the philosophical underpinnings of her educational views, right? She's coming with a predisposed mind about education. She's coming with preconceived notions about education, and our job as good students will be to not take things on face value, but to at least ask important questions as to, well, she says read things one at a time, one list at a time. Is she correct? Why is she correct? Why does one list at a time work? Right? And then you can sort of go on Google or YouTube and the power of doing one thing at a time, perhaps, or go and ask ChatGPT or ask someone you trust from the ulama, the scholars, right? And then take their input and see, okay, she has a point, and then perhaps you already know a hadith about this, right? One thing at a time, small things, small steps, right? Baby steps towards a goal. And then you can sort of see, starting with the originals and then sort of coming down, and then her principle, right? The assumption behind that principle, i.e., that you see the development of ideas in real time, right? By way of reading things in chronology, according to its chronology, right? You can see, is that even correct? Why is she saying that? What's the opposite of that? Would it be, if she's saying come top down, we normally in schools do go bottom up, right? We have textbooks on mathematics, right? And those books don't really take us to elements of Euclid's or other great books, or perhaps the papers on relativity by Einstein. You do study relativity perhaps in a undergraduate textbook of physics, but you don't really go and study the actual paper by Einstein, right? Why is that? It's because they assume that you can't understand the mathematics of Einstein, but they are teaching you the same mathematics in their textbook, right? So it's not that you can't understand the concept or the level of thought of Einstein in his articles. It's just they want to dumb down things, and they just want to publish another book and make money out of it. And there's a lot of you know business behind things that happens. Okay, education, literature is really not a lot that you need to tackle. Of course, when it comes to Islamic scholarship, the higher you can imagine, the higher you aspire, the difficult the job becomes, the more you have to read and so on and so forth. But the initial comprehensive education is not that difficult. And likewise with comprehensively educating yourself in other disciplines is not that difficult. It's just sticking to a few books which are good books, and then reading around them if you need to, inshallah. Okay. Um, there is a concept which is the fourth stage of reading, which is syntopical reading, i.e., you study one book, but then you read around that book, the same topic, but you read it in other books. Perhaps you're reading about habit building. So instead of just reading one book, you have one main textbook, one core text, and then around that you have other textbooks, and you explore their contents page and see, okay, you know what, this point that this author makes has also been made by this other author, and he's saying it in a slightly different context. So perhaps that way the application of it would differ, right? So you find more ideas when you read syntopically. Now, so inshallah, this is another thing. I I wanted to show you the journals, but we've already spent 2 hours, almost 2 hours in this seminar. So perhaps we can leave our journaling for after Ramadan, inshallah. I want you guys to focus on your Ramadan now. You've read a lot, mashallah, and you've tried your hardest and you've tried very well, mashallah. You've made some progress, and towards the beginning we discussed this and we saw how, mashallah, this 1 month has affected you positively, alhamdulillah. So now there's a break, there's a Ramadan, and Ramadan is for the Quran. So inshallah, take your time with the Quran and perhaps try and read about the Quran syntopically. Open up a translation and look up a theme and just try and answer, look up a bit more about that topic in different books and seerah and Google and lectures, you know, and sort of spend that time, the same skills that you've gathered here, apply them on the Quran, perhaps even if it's just one small chapter of the Quran, right? But try and do that with the Quran this Ramadan, right? Inshallah. So enough of that. May Allah bless all of you. Just last few minutes, I want to take your feedback on today's seminar. Please let me know how you found today's seminar before we call it a day, inshallah. We'll just take your thoughts now, inshallah, and then we'll call it a day. And Sister Rabia, we have I've shared the link with you for the Telegram group, inshallah. If you're interested in these classes, in these seminars, you can join the group, inshallah, and stay updated with regards to the reading activity, inshallah, and the resources. And if you would like to continue with this, we're just going through a trial phase for 3 months. It ends at the end of April, and after that, inshallah, we'll open up registrations for our year-long program of the reading program, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so one last thing before we go. Alhamdulillah, very, very good comments. Yes, that's fine, sister, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. One last thing before you guys go is that in your weekly seminars amongst yourselves, do not take them light. Do not take them, do not think of them as something little. Okay? Every opportunity that you get to discuss your thoughts, to just discuss your ideas amongst yourselves, is a ghanima. Okay? It's an opportunity. It's a real opportunity for you to truly develop yourself. Okay? Because if you don't speak your minds, you don't develop your minds. Speaking your mind is very important for you to develop yourself. Okay, inshallah? So make sure whatever happens, right? Even if I'm not doing the seminar leader must show up and must do the seminar. Okay, inshallah? And of course, this will apply to now, of course, after Ramadan. But I want you guys to make sure that whenever your weekly seminars happen, the seminar leader, they show up, and even if it's just one student with them, they do the seminar. Even if it's just one student, just the two of them, right? It doesn't have to be the entire group. But for the rest of the students, they should, whatever happens, they shouldn't take things lightly. And perhaps a day is difficult for all of you to gather, right, and meet. Decide amongst yourselves if you guys can do another day in the week, right? Another time in the week. But make sure that you guys definitely meet up and have that form of dialogue amongst yourselves. It doesn't have to be a Monday evening, it can be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You have the rest of the week, amongst yourselves, inshallah. So make sure you guys find time for the weekly seminars amongst yourselves as well. Okay. And and as you go through these seminars with me, you're seeing the kind of questions you should be asking. You're seeing the kind of critique that you should be having amongst yourselves, the kind of the way that you should be dealing with literature, right? These are just these are forms of training. These are sample engagements that you guys have with me, inshallah, and then you can sort of take this away and sort of replicate them up between yourselves, amongst yourselves, inshallah. Is that understood, inshallah? Okay, inshallah. All right. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair, everyone. Barakallahu feekum. Hopefully, everyone benefited from today's seminar. A lot of interesting discussions happened, and I hope I've not pushed anyone too far or disrespected anyone. The whole point was to make you guys think, and I'm always trying to be um, trying to bring the best out of you guys to whatever capacity I can, and without pushing anyone too hard. So please do forgive me if that happens, because in my life, in my personal one-to-one sessions, or in my class sessions, when people are in person with me, they do face a lot more of me. And considering that there's the sisters in the group, I try not to be too picky or too critical. But inshallah, if I do, just do forgive me. That is something I have to do as a teacher, and I have to fulfill that role. But inshallah, if anyone is hurt, I apologize for being critical and picking up on your responses. I definitely don't intend to offend anyone, inshallah. Okay. So jazakumullah khair, everyone. Especially Sister Hannah. I I was very critical of her today, especially. But I was also um, um, I did praise her responses as well. So may Allah bless all of you, inshallah. Okay. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullahu khairan. Have a blessed Ramadan, all of you. Have a splendid Eid, and inshallah, I'll see all of you at the other end if Allah allows us to see Ramadan and live for that long and meet again, inshallah. Okay, so continue to please remember myself and my family and the project in your du'as in Ramadan, and try to act upon the brief advice that I gave you guys in the last tafsir halaqa. And with that, we'll end today's session. Barakallahu feekum. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. أستغفرك وأتوب إليك اللهم تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلى الله على النبي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.